Good morning. Welcome to the Ford Foundation. My name is Rebecca Coakley, and I'm the U.S. Disability Rights Program Officer here. I'm a white woman with dwarfism, chin-length red hair, a glorious abundance of freckles, and I am wearing a red dress and really awesome shoes that I'm wearing because Sammy Schock is here speaking today. I want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the tremendous logistical hurdles that our speakers encountered in order to be with us today. Apparently, New York has seen it all except for fog. But because we had planned ahead of time that this would be a hybrid event, we were ready to go depending on whatever circumstances we had. That's the beauty that disability brings to the work, an added level of flexibility and making things happen, even in the strangest and most bizarre of circumstances sometimes. I'd like to thank the event staff at Ford, and also a moment to thank our amazing gallery curator, Lisa Kim, who is not with us today, even though she very much wanted to be. Lisa and her team were instrumental in pulling this event together. Lisa, I know you're working from home today, so I want to acknowledge a tremendous effort that you and your team put out to pull this together with us. I also want to strongly encourage everyone to check out Ford's latest gallery exhibit downstairs, Disposable Tactics for Care and Mourning, which features some of Sammy's work in addition to a number of amazing artists here in our gallery. To say I am excited to host this book launch for Dr. Sammy Schock's Black Disability Politics is frankly the understatement of the year. When I came to the Ford Foundation to build out our U.S. disability rights strategy, almost 2 years ago at this point, I was really deliberate and intentional in wanting to do so, but through the lens of racial and gender justice. Sammy was one of the voices in my head throughout the construction of our U.S. strategy. And when she and I talked about the crux of this book, I may have actually done tangible cartwheels when she agreed to let us host a launch. Because this is the kind of cutting edge, challenging the status quo, important work that the Ford Foundation, under the leadership of our CEO, Darren Walker, is compelled to do. As Darren reminds me frequently, it's about embracing risk and reflecting honesty. Today's event will feature Dr. Schock in conversation with a very special guest, and then move to a panel with a number of the individuals featured in the book, facilitated by the amazing Kara Reedy from the Disabled Journalists Association. Sammy's work has left fingerprints all over the last 2 years of our grant-making strategy, and I couldn't be more proud. And I would like to introduce our author and our special guest star with a quote from the end of the introduction of the book. If you are not a Black person, imagine that you just walked into my living room where I'm having a conversation with my Black family and friends. You're welcome to come in and listen and learn in the conversation, maybe even contribute to it in appropriate ways. But the conversation is not for or about you. For my Black readers, welcome. Settle into the space. Mark the pages. Make it yours. Pass it along. If this book is helpful to you, meaningful to you, that is what matters here. If these ideas are developed to even get us slightly closer to collective liberation, then I've done what I've set out to do. Friends of the Ford Foundation, let me welcome Dr. Sammy Schock in conversation with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Hello.
Hello.
Congresswoman, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yay. Hi.
I'm sorry, I was so stunned by your beauty. So I'm hoping that you will offer a descriptive for this incredible dress or gown that you are wearing. It looks like purple tulle.
Yes, it's a lot of tulle. So I'm in an off-the-shoulder, like grape royal purple, mid-length tulle gown with some sparkly docks because I love a sparkle dock.
My goodness. Well, I am really excited to join you for this conversation today, and just so grateful for all of your thought leadership. It's always great to be in, actually glorious, better than great, to be in community with all of you, whether virtually or in person. And before you get into the Q&A, I'll just say I am a Black, bald woman living with alopecia universalis, which is my superpower. I am wearing hoop earrings and pink lipstick and a black and pink t-shirt representing GCR, Adaptive Splash. This is clothing to empower and provide adaptive fashion to people with disabilities to achieve their maximum potential and feel confident in their own skin. And they sent this to me, and I'm very happy to be repping them today.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you want to just get right into it?
Let's do it. So I think I want to start with talking about disability identity. Can you talk about how you came into your disability identity and claiming disability publicly?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank the community for embracing me, for being a safe space for me to stand boldly in that new aspect of my identity. I so often say that I'm not here just to occupy space, I'm here to create it. And I learned that from my siblings in the disability community and broader movement. And so I thank the community for being my community, being my village, but also being my teachers and my guides. I, for a couple of years now, have been living publicly with alopecia. I lost all the hair on my head, my face, and my body in about a 5-week period. And I wore a wig for probably 2 weeks and decided early on that did not feel an authentic representation of how I wanted to show up in the world. And at that point, decided that I would be publicly sharing this new walk, this new aspect of my identity. And, I'm a deeply spiritual person, and a faith leader in my community had said to me, your territory will only be enlarged. And at the time, I had not fully appreciated what that meant, because given the messages from society, I was very focused on the deficit and all that I was losing, and was so squarely focused on what I was losing in terms of what I defined my expression of womanhood, of femininity, of ethnic pride, of my beauty, of that physical presentation that made me more palatable to others, which is really ultimately, what it came down to, that I hadn't realized what I was gaining. And my husband likes to say that alopecia did not rob me of my beauty, that it revealed it. And not just in a physical sense, because he appreciates my cheekbones, but because of what I had to summon internally to enter spaces, recognizing that just how I show up was disruptive.
I love that. I think that for so many of us, coming into disability identity, especially if it's happening in life, it takes time, but that support from community and knowing that we're having access to that makes such a difference. For me, I've been in disability studies a long time, and it still took me a while to claim disability because I felt like, oh, I have that on top of being Black and queer and a woman. It just seems like a lot. It seems like a lot.
Well, that was actually my question for you. Just, exposure to disability as a concept or community was just, where did that show up for you, and for you as well? Yeah.
So it started a long time ago. I took a class my sophomore year of college called Women in Disability. I was a women's studies major. It fit in my schedule. It was an elective. That's how you choose classes. And at the time, I had just started coming out to my friends. And again, so I was Black and queer and a woman. And I was like, I know everything there is to know about oppression, like, got it done. And I took the class and it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind that I had never thought about disability from such a critical perspective. And, you know, I tell this story to my students who take a similar class with me. But for me at the time, I was like, is this what it feels like for white people when they find out about white privilege? This doesn't feel good. Like, I feel like, how could I have missed this, you know? So it started there. And even though I did have disabilities at the time, I didn't identify as disabled because I didn't know if I was disabled enough. And I didn't think that my experience fit what I was seeing in a lot of disability studies classes, which were very, very white. And really, it was through doing the research for this book and interviewing the activists, some of whom are here today to talk to us later, that made clear to me that I couldn't just identify as, excuse me, as disabled privately and with friends, but I really needed to claim it publicly to do this work well and to, come into my community more clearly. So that was the trajectory. And so for me, it's also pretty new to be claiming disability as publicly as I do now. And I'm so grateful.
We're grateful that you are, that you have made that choice and done so with intention. And boldness and unapologetically. I often say that I hope that the policies that I write make people feel the way Maya Angelou made me feel the first time I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings as a child that was experiencing, trauma and abuse, that I wasn't alone, And so really that's what it all comes down to, because this can be very isolating. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I think one of the questions we had, talked about was like Black disability community and how it brings us joy. And I was part of a conversation that you hosted for Black disabled women a while ago. I don't even know how long ago. That was one of the most joyful things I've ever experienced, to see so many of us in one Zoom screen. It was beautiful. So can you talk about, bringing folks together intentionally around, Black disabled community and what that brings for you?
I think I'll just first, give credit. We're always, as Black women, wanting to be intentional about not being complicit in the erasure of Black women and thought leadership and scholarship. So I have to give it up to Dr. Lee Kimberly Crenshaw, because, what I really wanted to do was move in a way that is intersectional and inclusive in my movement building, because that's the way that I seek to legislate, because that is the way that we live. And I'll also just say the reason I wanted to be intentional about creating that space is that, as we so often talk about in organizing spaces, no one is voiceless. What they are is unheard. And I think the experience of those who are Black and disabled, there have been so many of you on the front lines, but who have really been sort of the canaries in the coal mine, sharing that lived experience, telling that story, ensuring that you are not excluded from tables and conversations and policies and movements. But we have to do better. And so if you are serious about the work of liberation, of Black liberation, then that is an interconnected fight. And so for me, when I say Black Lives Matter, that means globally, that means Haitian lives matter, right? And that means that disabled Black lives matter, that our freedoms and our destinies are tied. And so really, I'm just trying to do my part to create tables, even if they're virtual, to create spaces where we can challenge ourselves to be more intentional and more inclusive in our movement building, in our lawmaking, and in our community building. Yeah.
So Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I did have a question for you. Because we're here to talk about your book, so I don't want us to lose sight of that. So, speaking about the work of Black liberation, right? And speaking about erasure, very often I think there are elements in the work, in the history of Black liberation, that are erased from the narrative, right? So, in the book, we see the Black Panthers do serious coverage on disability and the 504 sit-ins. They clearly saw disability as both part of their community and a rights-based movement. So what does today's Black media coverage tell us about how disability is perceived?
I think that disability is still left out of a lot of Black media coverage. I think what we see a lot of times are these more individual stories, stories of overcoming, rather than really focusing on this as a political issue. And I think that's what was so great about what I found in the archive of the Panthers, is that they were absolutely understanding disability rights and access for disabled folks as a political issue, understanding disabled folks as an oppressed community, that their liberation was tied to larger Black liberation as well. And so I think that political element, really understanding this as a social and political issue, understanding ableism as a systemic oppression, is sometimes missing from the way that we talk about disability in Black media that can be very focused on individual experiences, heartwarming experiences. And so that's why, I'm very intentional about following the work of other Black disabled activists who are putting out things that are more comprehensive and critical to open up this conversation. And I do think things are shifting. A lot of folks, and as I've been talking about the book to people, have been bringing up the example of the Lizzo and Beyonce lyric that got changed, and the way that Black disabled folks were leading that conversation and doing that bridge work, that I think is really critical. So I hope that more Black media outlets are having Black disabled folks write about our own experiences. I had to, when I had the Essence covered the book recently, and at first they wanted to use the word differently abled, and I was like, no. Sorry, babes. And so, I have to do that educational work. I can't assume that, a Black journalist is going to necessarily know the right words to use. And so even though the general disability rights movement and disability justice folks have been, I think, doing this work and pushing within media, I think there's still more work to do in terms of our own community to make sure that folks are just aware. I think that a lot of people aren't opposed to making changes in their language, for example. They just truly don't know. They thought they were doing the right thing, even though I never used that phrase throughout the entirety of the interview. So yeah, it requires us to still do a lot of educational and bridge work, just like we were seeing with the Panthers work 50 years ago.
Absolutely. And I'm so, we do have to have those, truth-telling, teachable moments, including and especially with family. And I mean that both in the sense of our home community, but also literally, within our own families. When I think about my stepfather, a Black man who's been deaf since the age of 6, an only child growing up in the 1950s, his parents never learned how to sign. They felt great shame about his disability. And he experienced, because they were very focused on really assimilation. That was how they saw true Black liberation was, don't be disruptive, assimilate, fit in, and you will be successful. And, sort of how are you going to fit in if you're a Black boy already, there's inherent challenges with that, with navigating the world. And now you're deaf. And he just felt such great shame and also experienced so much discrimination. He's, educated, but people constantly questioned his intellect and spoke to him as if he was developmentally challenged, when really it was just that he's deaf. And so he decided to really focus on excelling athletically, and working, I don't know, physically, and went on to have great success in that way as a track coach and athletically. But I just say all that to say that the media and the stories they tell and what they shape, it does have such a profound impact. Maybe if my stepfather had had that representation, and his parents had had that representation, he would not have been walking around with shame. They would not have been walking around with shame. And he would not have grown up in a family that made no effort to communicate with him in a way that he could understand. But I also want to just give you a moment to flex, because essence is a big deal. So we do just, I want to hold space for that. You just drop that, that crown so casually, but that is a big deal. And we are so proud of you and so grateful for you that others will now have that consciousness. But I also like how you went about it. I think it's important that we not shame people. If we want to bring people along, if we want them to learn those lessons and pass them on, we have to create safe space for them as well.
Absolutely. I think that was a huge lesson that I had from interviewing the contemporary activists. Again, that some folks you'll hear from later, that it's okay for folks to be in different stages of their identity development. And the more that we, and I mean this is like the broader disability rights community, the more that mostly white disabled folks are saying, you have to say disabled, you have to claim that so you are disabled, and you have to use these kind of words to describe yourself, it forces people out of a community that already is very white and might not feel like the right place for them. And then you're telling them the language they use is wrong and they don't know this and they don't know that. And so I think there's this gentleness that we can that we can bring people in and educate and say, do this at your own pace. You're welcome here. It's going to take folks a while sometime to deal with that shame, to deal with the internalized oppressions that we experience as multiply marginalized people. And I think especially in this moment, I think a lot about COVID and the impacts on Black and Brown communities, that we have a lot of folks who are newly disabled, and we need to bring them in with care and with love as they figure out how to live in a very ableist world with whatever long COVID looks like for them.
Yes. I want everyone to know that I'm snapping right now, in response to that. And again, disability advocates just leading on the front lines of so many issues, predicting that COVID would be a mass disabling event, and supporting our COVID long haulers is an issue that I'm working very closely on. One more issue that I wanted to raise on the media piece, which seems very topical given the covering of Fetterman in Pennsylvania. So I've been really thinking about that and how the media has been covering disability and politics in that Pennsylvania Senate race. But that is far from the only example. But it does, speak to our ableism. But it's so important that we have that diversity of perspective and lived experience, I believe, at policy and decision-making tables, that proximity for him as a stroke survivor and what that new reality is for him only creates space for others, and I think would only make him that much more impactful at the policy table. So talk to me a little bit about, what does Black disability politics mean to you?
So I've been having to tell folks, like, I'm actually not a policy person. So this is, if you think this is a policy book, it's not. For me, Black disability politics are about the way that Black communities approach disability as a social and political issue. And the reason that I got into writing this book was because I was seeing so many folks say, well, Black people have distanced themselves from disability and they don't address it and they don't talk about it. And I was like, or what if we talk about it differently? Like, maybe you're looking the wrong way for this. And so I just got interested in digging in a little deeper, particularly for health activism, to be like, what what are we actually doing? What have we done? And that's really what I learned, is that our political approach within Black communities just looks a little bit different, because a lot of times we are addressing disability that comes from racialized violence, state neglect. And so we're talking about disability in the context of anti-Blackness, essentially. And that looks very different than the way that disability is experienced for white folks. And so that's what Black disability politics are for me. It's how we address disability politically and socially, within the context of our particular experiences and within the context of an ableist and racist world.
Doctor, I wonder if, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so please feel free to say that's a conversation for another day. But again, as we think about the role of history and media and narrative and storytelling, do you think that one of the reasons it's a struggle to answer for many, what is Black disability politics, what does that look like, is that there are so many Black disabled folks who have not been public about their disabilities. Sheroes and heroes who were architects of the civil rights movement, as an example, and there's still debate today as to whether or not they were disabled, and that is true even still today. So there are folks who were the architects who provided us the blueprint, but because they did not claim that piece of their identity, I think it's one of the reasons why we struggle, today with, like, what is this construct? What does it mean to be multiply marginalized, as you said, characterized so eloquently there, Doctor? So could you speak to that a moment? And I just wonder if we could give some sunlight to some of those names that people may not know and be unaware of.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case, that we don't have our Black disabled history. And that's because folks lived in an ableist world where claiming that label did not necessarily work or make sense for them. And again, that's why it gets overlooked. But I think identifying and finding our history, knowing that there are so many Black disabled activists in our history, is important. It gives us not just a sense of having foremothers and forefathers and folks who came before us, but also gives us these lessons. So the one that, I think Ford just did a discussion on, but Fannie Lou Hamer, really her life experience stands out to me. Her experience with reproductive violence, but also police violence, right? Being beaten in a jail cell, and being disabled from that as well. And that I love that that's now coming out in the way that the new book about her really addresses disability, and there've been conversations about it, that we're not only identifying like, oh, there's a person with a disability, there's a person with a disability, which is important, but also really thinking about, and then how did the fact that they lived with a disability as a Black person impact the way they organized, impact the kind of policies and protests, the things that they did, with an understanding of disability from lived experience in that. And that's what I think is the really impactful part of finding our history, is that we can also get guidance on what to do and learn from mistakes, but know that there's a way of moving through the world, there's a way of organizing that has always been influenced by disabled folks, whether or not we're using that word or whether or not we know that. So that's Fannie Lou Hamer is the one that's like really standing out, I think, just because there's been so much conversation recently. But of course, Harriet Tubman with the Harriet Tubman Collective, named after her, is another one that I think folks just erase these experiences and these identities because they weren't claimed and using the language that we use right now. But there's going to be value in that. I'm getting the wrap it up cue.
I'm sad that I've been missing out on those conversations, Doctor. I hope someone will drop the name of the Fannie Lou Hamer book into the chat, or I'll Google it and look it up myself, so that I can add that to my list. But I think for me, what does Black disability politics mean to me? I think in this moment, it's evolution. It's an evolving construct if you will. I think we have found ourselves at an unprecedented time as a country, and really are on the precipice, at an inflection point here. And we're all challenging ourselves to not default to a pre-pandemic unjust status quo normal. And so I'll just say, for me, what I'm thinking about is that sort of system and human infrastructure and movement infrastructure that meets the moment, that in this third reconstruction that Reverend Barber speaks so frequently about, that we are getting it right, that we are doing better, again, that we are being intentional and inclusive and empowered and unapologetic. And the other thing I'll just say that's important to me is that because none of us do live in silos, is that I like to lift up scholars in the Black disabled community beyond their disability activism. But just to lift up again the fact that thought leadership is thought leadership, and this brilliance is adaptable. It is transcendent, and it's so important to me, that we not be pigeonholed, that we not be siloed. If you're a good organizer, you're a good organizer. If you're a good researcher, you're a good researcher. If you're a dope author, you're just a dope author and an incredible writer. And I think it's important that we challenge folks in that way as well, both to not approach us from a deficit mindset, but also not to silo us. Yeah. Do you have any summarizing thoughts on that?
No, I'm just so grateful for you doing this. It means the world. Thank you so much for your time here.
Absolutely. So happy to be with you. So proud of you. And I look forward to us being together sometime soon, okay? After I've read the book. After I've read the book fully, okay?
And
all right.
Ayana, we texted you the URL for the book, so you have it.
Oh, that's Coakley. That's my sister right there. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Congresswoman. And now we'd like to welcome up our panel. And our panel will be facilitated by the amazing Kara Reedy, who is the founder of the Disabled Journalists Association.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kara Reedy. I'm the director and founder of the Disabled Journalists Association. It's newly formed. We're still working it out. So far, we've been teaching newsrooms how to do better coverage of disability. We're going to start out with everybody introducing themselves. So, Candace?
Sure. Hi, my name is Candace Coleman. I am from Chicago. I identify as a Black disabled girl from the south side of Chicago. I have mixed color hair, brown and black. I have on a green top as well as a black top as well. And my face is long and I like to smile, so.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Coakley. I'm a fair-skinned African-American man with long locks, wearing a blue suit and burgundy shirt today. I also serve as the Chief of Organizing, Advocacy, and Learning for Civic Influencers, and I have been low vision my entire life, and I'm super excited to talk to all of you about the Black disability experience. V?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Violetta Thompson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a light-skinned Black woman who's sitting in a wheelchair. I'm wearing a very colorful dress with pink shoes, and I am the founder of Ramp Your Voice. And I'm also a social worker, writer, activist, speaker. I'm so happy to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Watkins. I'm a Boston-based disability rights activist. I am a light-complected Black woman born with a form of muscular dystrophy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm wearing black pinstripe pants, I guess, leggings, black sweater, and a vest, and a pocketbook, and I have curly hair, and I think that's it. And I'm happy to be here today as well.
Thank you. I forgot to do my image description. I'm a light-skinned dwarf African-American woman who's wearing a bright yellow African print dress and my hair is out, so it's curly and shoulder length and dark brown. So I had such the pleasure of reading the book. I've been reading it for the past week, and then I'm nervous because I've known of all of you. I know Patrick, but like I've known all of you via Twitter and your work. So I'm a little nervous. Hope I ask the right questions and get this conversation going. One of the things that struck me was two of you belong to the Harriet Tubman Collective.
All of us.
All of you do?
All of us. Yes.
I got misinformation. Excuse me, all of you do. And so one of the things that I thought was super interesting about the collective was that you made sure that you could call everyone out, that depending like the intersecting groups on their ableism. And can we talk a little bit about when you first started, of what that felt like, and was there pushback? And anyone can answer this.
I'll start a first run at that. I'd say first thing, one of the cool things about the Harriet Tubman Collective, especially in our discussions of sort of Black disability politics and the way Dr. Sammy talked about it, is that it very much was equally sort of like your mom's kitchen, but in that it was a safe place to explore what all of those things meant, but it was also the place where you were called to task very readily and very quickly. So on one hand, yes, there was a liberating piece of it. We had some hard conversations with a lot of movements in the disability space, but then also movements like Movement for Black Lives Matter, for things that they were doing that were ultimately ableist. But then also one of the things I think that was one of the strongest things about the Harriet Tubman Collective is that magnifying glass was also often turned internally on us as well. So, it was one thing, yes, being able to say we need to address ableism in all its forms without the Black community or outside the Black community, but then also we often found ourselves being called to task by fellow members about either internal ableism that we either brought about in the group or to challenge ourselves to think about things in different ways. It was not easy, and it continues to not be easy.
Anyone else want to tackle that?
Yeah, because it had so many overlapping identities, and people forget about that. You're not just Black and disabled. You might have, gender identities. You might be a mother. A parent. And so, when we consider how so many of us are in need of care, right? Caregivers, community builders, all at once. We have to, and so many of us live in that continuum. People don't really conceptualize disability in that way, and how expansive it is, and how we're so deeply rooted in the community in that way, and how contributing disability is. So many conversations like that, I think, where people were like, their worldview of disability. Oh, sorry about that. Where their worldview was more expanded because of our conversations, I think.
I want to add that we're a very diverse, interesting group of people from across the country.
Oh, yes.
I want to say it was one of the few spaces where we were able to get together to have these deep conversations. And I also want to add that the internet really allowed us to come together to have the conversation when we were all frustrated by various things as it related to racism, ableism, and just our various ways that we approach the work.
And I would like to add, for me, when HTC was formed, I was just coming into this space. So it was nice to meet other Black disabled folks doing similar work, different work than myself. So just really having a community within a community, and just really expanding your own understanding of who's there and how we connect and creating friendships. And that's how I met Patrick. Like, I didn't know, outside of Heather, I didn't know anyone else in that group. So it was just really nice to just meet folks in this work and to have those friendships and workshops in there.
Indeed. I was actually following Vilissa's website before we met. I was a huge fan, still am, obviously, a huge fan of Ramp Your Voice, but I was a huge fan of that. And one of the things I think is interesting about Ramp Your Voice, about the Harriet Tubman Collective, even about my website, Lead On Update, was that all of us were looking for ways to sort of like capture and codify this information around the disability experience, but that also kind of, I think, incorporated our own lens because we weren't really seeing it out there in the world.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of interesting that even before we got to Harriet Tubman, we were sort of trying to figure out like how we could do that and how we could create that sort of space that we wanted that was inclusive of our Blackness as well as our disability identity.
Right. Because so many of us are siloed in our own communities, even within the disability community. I mean, you know, I had that supportive network, but I didn't have other Black disabled folks who, and I'm not just talking about a parent, I'm talking about non-apparent chronic illness folks who, you know, share their lens and their lived experience. And you need that mirror out in the world if you're a Black and disabled person. Because you don't necessarily get that within your own community. Because as Rep. Presley was saying, as Dr. Semi Shock was saying, you know, that has been shunned for so many reasons, right? Community, maybe religion, stigma, all of these different factors that take us longer to identify as having a disability or being disabled as an identity marker and not seeing it as an indictment.
I think what's interesting too is when what I read in the doctor's book is about how Black liberation of disabled people shows up differently because our culture is different, right? So have you ever had these moments where because I feel like we're looking back and reading everything that the Black Panthers were doing, which was just revolutionary for me. Like I knew about Black Panthers, but the fact that they were writing about disability sort of consistently, but also including it in their work. Sorry, there's a question. But like when you were working on your own journey, were you able to pull up that history for yourselves I mean, yes, you had community, but I think we all like to see ourselves in history. Were you able to pull that up and kind of learn from it and glean from?
So I didn't say my title in the beginning, which is that I'm actually a racial justice organizer now within the disability rights community, but I model disability justice. I want to be clear about that. And I started out youth organizing and trying to talk to young adults about their disability identity and how they navigate the world that we're in. And one of the things that I've had to always do in that work before the collective and before, you know, a book like this has come out is to really research prominent people who folks can relate to talk about their disability story in order to encourage people who don't know about Black disability identity, that it has existed before I've come to you. And so having a full circle experience of, oh, I didn't think about it this way, or this is what community looks like, or this is how I could navigate with support and accommodations, and bringing the stories of people before us to their journey in order to express what that looks like and how we've really been a pivotal factor in contributing to our society as a whole. One of the struggles, I think, even with this book, is that having a disability is not like an institutional learning experience. Like, it's not a part of how we learn about school. It's just about, you know, the medical diagnoses and what you can and cannot do. And so it expands beyond that as we are people. And I think this book will help shed light to that culture and that experience, with not just what I can't do, but how beautiful it is to be Black and disabled, and the contributing people before and thereafter, to raise awareness about our culture and community as a whole.
Yeah.
Because we need that, right? We need to know where we came from, and especially, you know, as young people or someone who's newly disabled, we need to know who our cultural icons are and our forebears, like Fannie Lou Hamer, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Brad Lomax, as mentioned. And that, because that helps us really conceptualize the idea of disability and what that looks like. And the way they govern their lives, the trajectory of their lives. How would a young person view that in that way? I know for me, if I had have learned that, that would have helped shape my self-awareness and help sharpen my advocacy skills. So it's really important.
I know that for me, in college, I was an African American Studies minor, and studying Harriet Tubman, learning about the Black Panthers, disability was not there. And looking back on that, if I had learned that as a young disabled college student who was intentional about learning more about my people in this way, I would have came more into my disability identity earlier than seeking it out in its professional scope. So, for me, a part of my work is getting Black scholars, some of the ones who's taught me, to be more intentional about how they introduce disability in this work, particularly with the young folks, whether it's teenagers, college students, and so forth. They need that history because this is shaping who they view themselves in this very formative years. So the omission is very great for those of us who maybe relate to Black history but don't see that disability aspect.
Yeah.
And think that there's disabled Black folks didn't exist or didn't do anything powerful, influential for our people.
Yeah.
When we've always been there, since enslavement. One of the pieces that I really read that always sticks out to me was the article talking about mothering the useless. And it talked about enslaved mothers and their disabled children. And I have never read any stories about that particular grouping during enslavement. And just really seeing how the omission is just so impactful for us as Black folks, but also everyone else who is trying to learn about American history and what it means to be a Black person in this country and its history. So I really think that, we have scholars who are being more intentional now to not just mention disability in their work, but also mention in a way that isn't detrimental to us as a people, to the stories of our history makers that should be told in a more fuller fashion, and to also ensure that there aren't disabled young folks growing up without understanding that they made a difference. People like you made a difference in our history, and that you're not alone in these stories, and you can have a better viewpoint of who you are and not feel so shameful or feel so isolated or just feel as if no one understands your plight, where there's so many of us that do, particularly as Black folks, and we do have a higher rate of disability. So just really shining that light from the omission is very critical to me and what I focus on, particularly when I engage with Black groups, about ensuring that the work that they do for our community is very intentional in the ways they discuss disability and how they engage with us as a people.
Yeah.
I'd like to be completely honest. I'm not new to being disabled. I've been disabled my whole life and knew that. My mother was a social worker, but I'm new to sort of exploring what that means in a larger sense, not just in a personal sense. And I think a lot. I think a lot about disability all day, every day. And one thing that I was thinking about was after slavery, how many disabled people must have come from there.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, we have a history of it.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why Native Americans and Black people have the highest rate of disability. Like, oppression creates it. It happens naturally, but it also creates it. When you are in white spaces talking about that, can you talk a little bit about the response that you get? Particularly, I'd like to talk about in white disabled spaces, because I think that and I'm just being honest, not enough light is being shown on how racist and violent those spaces can be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm new to this and I didn't know, and I ended up in a space and I was like, oh, okay, oh, wow, all right.
It's not an easy walk, which is the other reason why I think why all of us also like to sit next to each other more often than this, because even I've had the opportunity to teach some classes on like disability, and even do a couple of seminars specifically on like Black disability experiences and like disability history timelining, right? And in that you get to talk about some of the things we touched on, the fact that like, you know, the first instances of mental health related disabilities, even in our country, are actually tied to runaway slave syndrome. You know, and I don't know anybody that wants to be enslaved, so obviously there's some gray area about that. But like, you know, there is a mix, I think, of voyeurism that can also take place that we have to then think about. And a lot of that is tied to understanding sort of Blackness and Black identity. So it can be very uncomfortable for, I think, for us individually presenting in that space to people who may not have decided or may not have really thought about how to unpack all of the nuance tied to disability and disability identity. Like even when I've done disability timelines and history, we'll start with like almost a 30,000 foot like look at, you know, models of disability, what they mean, and then we walk them into thinking about now, knowing that how does this affect sexism? How does this affect gender? How does this affect race? It's not an easy talk. I'll tell you that inside of Black community circles, it's a little bit easier, but the conversation normally goes something like this. I'll sit down with a group of people and say, hey, tell me about how you talk about disability. And they'll say, well, it's nobody's business. You know, you keep it to yourself. You do you. You're as good as anybody else, but you just work as hard as you can. Don't worry about it. And if someone asks, you can tell them, but it's no big deal. Then we say, well, tell me how you talk about your Blackness. Oh, that's your history. You got to know who you are, where you're coming from. It's got to be tied to you. It's got to be connected. And then because we have that connection we know with each other, we can say, now you see how you're talking about Blackness in one way, you're talking about disability in the other. And if you're a parent, you're just confusing your poor child.
Yeah.
Like, we can use that as a connection. In some of these outside spaces, we don't always have that hook.
Yeah.
It's not as easy to explain to them that cultural nuance that connects those things together. So it really takes a lot of folks like us to sort of push this as a going on conversation, because sometimes it just feels like the knowledge isn't out there.
I know that for me, I do a lot of trainings in non-disability spaces. That's where I feel the safest in, because I don't want to deal with white disabled folk shenanigans. Basically, I've dealt with it enough. But what I find is that I'm very intentional about the spaces I create, and I use my social work background to lead that. I always create a space of make sure that people know that they're safe to ask these silly, quote unquote, questions, the questions that make them uncomfortable with the way that we're going over things, and also ensure that the disabled folks that are in the room are, you know, intentionally safe. Some of them may be out about their disability status. Depends on the group or the company, and some may not be. So for me, in coming into typically non-disabled spaces, making sure I have command of the room as a Black disabled woman, leading the training with typically majority white audiences is very intentional. It's very important to me for my own safety, because I know I'm talking about things that people are going to be uncomfortable with. Yeah. I'm talking about, you know, things that people are going to be experiencing for the first time, you know, or may know loosely about, but not in a way that's more in alignment with the community, with the progressive understanding of the movement. So for me, it's about having that control so people know that you are the captain of the ship, that they are the crew that you care about, but there's only one captain. But the thing I have learned in being in these spaces is that I have felt more reception of what has been shared than being in disabled spaces. That has been the most surprising element. Folks actually want to learn. Yeah. Folks actually want to do better for themselves. for their colleagues, and for their community. What I found is folks have a genuine interest in wanting to get it right and knowing what they're getting wrong. The thing that always sticks out to me that I do in my training is about ableist language. And folks are just always surprised at the everyday words that's in our vocabulary that can be offensive. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. I'm like, yes, you didn't know, but now you do. Let's work on us being more intentional and creative about the words that we use so that we don't unknowingly ostracize somebody who is coming to their identity, who may not see you as a safe space anymore because you're using words that make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And also, a lot of folks do a lot of self-reflection and just really wanting to know, how can I be a better co-conspirator or accomplice for not just the folks that I work with or engage with, but also in other aspects too. So that's what I found in working outside of disability and really being a part of groups that really want to do the change.
Yeah.
And if they reach out to you, they do have an interest in wanting to do the change and figuring out what that means for their organization, not just for that moment of how many hours you're with them, but also long term.
Can you ask the question again?
Well, it was sort of a two-parter. I asked about how you navigate white disabled spaces and the racism and violence that sometimes is propagated in those spaces.
So, as a community organizer, first of all, I want to say I've been in space for almost 13 years now. And so I remember beginning organizing and really focused on Black and Latinx issues. And one of the things that is plaguing our community is police violence. And I remember, in organizing spaces, getting arrested was like the coolest thing to do. And I was so afraid and no, I can't do this. And the question is well, why? I'm like, y'all could go home with a record and live your life to the fullest. I have to worry about being killed. If I do get a record, I won't get a job. How does this affect my community? I can't do this same type of activity. And so I found myself having to explain that repeatedly in the very beginning. The other thing that's really frustrating about being Black and doing disability work is not having Black-led national organizations to look at policy on what impacts us. So when I'm bringing up issues like the school to prison pipeline or mental and behavioral health crises and the over-policing of my communities, no one knows what that looks like or feels like because the status quo of what's on a policy level that's correct comes from a white perspective. Right. And so I've had to always fight for my base of folks who are advocates, had to create a safe space to do it, but also had to fight against this idea of what's appropriate campaigning for this work. And so that's another reason why I think this is a really late space to be in right now, is to bring forth Black disability identity, because it's just, when I first came into the movement, it was a privilege to say you were disabled. Because you can be disabled and get your accommodations and your diagnoses and your supports and services. And I think that's one of the struggles with being Black and disabled, is that it comes with nothing. Right. No support. I mean, the most support we can get right now is being in the community amongst each other. But we now have to fight even more vigorously for what we need in order to just live our lives at a balanced level.
That's an interesting point, because that's when I'm teaching newsrooms, I'm always like, do you understand that when you're looking at disability, you can't not look at race?
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at stories like Flint, Michigan, even New Orleans with Katrina, all of these man-made / natural disasters create disability, but they also affect Black people more, Black and Native American people more than other people. Right. And so if you're only reporting on white people, how are people supposed to make policy based on something that's not even hitting the mark? Like, the mark is here, and you're over here talking about, curb cuts, which we need.
Yeah.
But like, people are dying.
But in addition to people dying, when they tell a story, my group Advance Your Leadership Power was tracking police interactions and people with disabilities. But when they tell the story of the victim, they never told the disability story.
Yeah.
And so we always recognize, like, this person is disabled. They're not saying that. They had a different set of experiences. This is probably why they were put in front of the police in the first place, or within the school to prison pipeline, is because they were disabled and they were not being accommodated. And so it's even in telling the story, not saying this person had this disability does a disservice to the whole situation in itself. And so we try to honor people's lives with that. And I always tell people, it's not about you becoming a part of the disability club.
Right.
It's about you understanding who you are, how your body responds in the environment that you're in, and what accommodations you need to accomplish the things that you would like to do. But we deal with all of these levels of oppression, and so the fight is harder. But so when talking about race and disability and intersectionality, we really have to take a critical look at all of those things in order to really address, like, what policy is doing. Because you could create a policy, but if it doesn't support the very people who you're writing it for, then what's the point of the policy?
Yeah.
Or the advocacy?
And I would just say that all of these things have connective tissue, because if it's not in media, across the media landscape in a comprehensive way, then it's always going to be reductive. The pendulum will swing from pity to pedestal, sadness to supercrib. And when people are conceptualizing what disability is or looks like, then we won't be a part of that conversation. And why is that important? Because people will become misinformed or uninformed, and that can make its way into the legislature.
Yeah.
And
Gut punch quality of life instead of supporting it.
Yep.
Exactly. And we're already seeing that start to play out. Like, that's already happened significantly. Like, I've worked in policy spaces for national policy related to disability. Large number of that space, significant, is mostly white led. And yet, when you get down to the level of the programs that we would take our policies from, all the learnings, they're largely black and brown led. Now, why is that? And it's part of that whole disconnect. And what's even more unnerving is something that Vilissa was talking about, which is that after a while, our black youth, our newer generations of black people with disabilities, start believing that either they don't have a space in a movement, that they've in essence been growing just with their sheer identity, or that, let's say, the cultural way in which we address disability inside of our black community that's been healthy, that does work, doesn't work nationally. Like, it's not a viable way for them to be involved in. And that's the thing that I'm afraid of the most.
Yeah.
I'm also a black college grad who needed disability engagement in undergrad so that I wouldn't fail my algebra class, which I almost did twice. But I didn't have any support that said, go find out about accommodations. These are things that you can use. This can be a positive part of your black identity. It wasn't there.
Yeah.
But even embracing the word disability, right? Yeah. And when we talk about the etymological breakdown, the DIS prefix is has a Latin and a Greek derivative. It's not only not and on, but it's duo and two, and so it's hence another way. Disability is the duality of being. So when you tell people that, it's more of like, oh, never thought about it that way. I know, because it's never covered expansively. And if it was, then you'd have a greater understanding of that. How many people know that you can be a disabled parent?
Right.
Hello, right? We don't talk about disabled parents,
No.
and that's important. We need that kind of education out there, so people can understand that we run the gamut of experiences. We're not just boxed in here and not here. We're everywhere.
Yep.
And we've always been there.
Always been.
Yep. So I got the rap signal, but I could talk to you guys for ever. I have 8 more questions at least, probably more than that. But we're gonna have Dr. Sammy come back and do some questions.
Hi, friends.
Hello.
So we're doing a Q&A from the audience. Is that what we're doing now? Yeah. Okay, so if you're here, there are mics on the side. And if you're on the internet, someone's going to vocalize your questions, I believe.
I was putting my leg back on so I could stand up, but it's all good. This is so awesome. I follow you all on Twitter. Y'all know me from my potty mouth and my sarcasm. So it's so exciting to see you guys here. And I'm constantly in a lot of talks around Blackness and disability. I've been in some webinars with Heather, and you know, what do you have like as advice for someone who's young and disabled and Black coming into this space? Because I was also very surprised by the racism in white disabled communities. I was like, why are you, we're on the same side, bro. Like, I don't understand why it was wild. And I'm still dealing with it, especially as light as I am. I'm Black and Palestinian, and they still don't want anything to do with me. But that being said, what would you say to a young organizer who's Black and disabled, trying to get into this space, but encountering all the gatekeeping and all the disrespect and thinking, I'll just go into private sector. I'll just go into something else. Like, what would your suggestion be to them?
Find Black people. Look, I mean, it's the good part about today's world is we have Twitter.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be in the same city, but seek out your people. You don't have to go to those spaces.
And art spaces.
Yeah.
How big, a lot of disabilities in art spaces. So, and it's softer approach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're involving your creativity, which can oftentimes be social and political commentary, right? So yeah, that's another area I'd suggest.
This is Candace. Just thinking about this. I had to do research, like ramped up what Balissa was doing, what Leroy Moore was doing, Patrick, like various people who've been in this movement way longer than me, experienced things way longer than I have. And so just talking with them to find out what are some ways that they navigated being in this space, but also seeing what they've been working on. A lot of the work that my peers on the panel and the peers who I know have really paved a way to make room for more younger people of color to participate in this movement, but also in other spaces as well. And so I would think reaching out to various people and talk to them about their journey. Also, panels like this, it's not very often. Some of us met for the first time, but we've been working together virtually for years. And so having space in Black space centered in disability is extremely important.
Kind of piggybacking on what Ken was saying is research and learn everything that you can. I know one thing that me and Heather always do. Heather's always sharing things with me, putting things on my radar. Keep a folder or bookmarks or something of the things that you learn in your activism. I know when I came to this space when I started my work in 2013, I was still on Tumblr before that went downhill. But that's where I first saw, particularly Black women in films, talk about ableism through an intersectional lens. And that really shaped my work and realizing, there are Black women who understand disability and race, and they're talking about it in a way that is helping me both find my voice and learn at the same time. And also molding me as to how I can be more intentional in the way that I shape things. And in that, I found other Black disabled women in films like Heather and Black disabled women in films reaching out to me when I first began this work. And I'm like, I am trying to figure out what I am doing here. And I'm glad that you found me so I can find you. But just know that you're going to find your people and just to soak up the information. Also be yourself. Yeah. I think that some of my gripe as a older head in this space is folks want to be like what everybody else is doing. Mm-hmm. Be yourself. we need Black disabled folks who are quirky, who have all these interests that may have nothing to do with activism. We need that diversity in what we're doing so that it's not always feeling like the same thing that's reshaped over and over again. So just being your authentic self and not worrying about having to fit a certain box, because you shouldn't have to worry about a box. You know, that's the beauty of, for me, being Black and disabled. I make my own lane and I can swerve in it however I want, and it's just as beautiful as what everybody else is doing.
I'll just add that including reading resources, giving those resources to other people, it is not your job to educate all those white folks. They can read. Hand them a book. Give them a link. Like, go read. And so I think, having those resources to give to folks to be like, because there's enough out there now. People can't claim that they don't know how to read about this or find this. There are enough of us. My book is open access, so anybody can read it online for free, download the PDFs. It's out there and it's accessible. So I think that's the other thing. Don't feel like your job is to teach white folks about racism every single day, because that will exhaust you.
And Valisa has a great syllabus, Black Disabled Woman Syllabus. Excellent resource. Excellent.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. A lot of good food for thought, and I'd actually like to ask some more questions about some of the things that I've heard today. First being ableism. It's a word that we hear a lot, but for the people on the panel, I'm interested in knowing what your definition is versus the legal definition or the textbook definition, something that's culturally competent versus, the word that's thrown around in different spaces. Oh, and the second question is, I'd like to talk more, we all know narratives are important, and I know I've had my own personal experiences as a person who identifies as a Black woman living with disabilities, but I'm interested in hearing, because I've never heard it put that way, and it was very powerful, examples of propagated violence and racism in disability spaces for white people. I know what I felt it, but I want to hear and identify specifically if anyone wants to share examples of those. So 2 separate questions.
Man, those are hard.
Yeah.
Those are hard questions.
Yeah.
I'll take a stab. Oftentimes when we think about ableism, and I want to be very sort of critical about the ways that we discuss excluding any people in the United States. Like one of the things that I'm always irritated about is when people talk about racism, for instance. There are those that think that racism is just separate fountains, separate drinking fountains, or separate entrances. They don't understand that there's sort of a systemic, sort of like culture that feeds into certain ideologies that makes someone that look like us less than. Ableism very much falls very much in line in the same way. It's not just a denigration of disability in general, or the attitude that suggests that a disability makes a person less than a person, but it's also all of the systemic processes that go into separating people with disabilities from having either open or equal access to all facets of our life. So they can be things as obvious as, well, I don't think a person with a disability is going to be a rocket scientist, so I'm not going to put an elevator in the NASA building, to, oh, I'm really into this modern movement that modern architectural not modern. Let's say I'm really into a Greek architectural movement that means that everything has to have stairs, and I'm not going to put ramps in because no one's going to deny my artistic vision. That's also a version of ableism. So it really ties back to thinking critically about your deliberate as well as the not so deliberate actions that are excluding people, and by that exclusion, taking away their personhood.
I don't have it memorized, but T.L. Lewis has a definition of ableism that's
great.
on T.L.'s social media. I quote it in the book, but it makes direct connections to the way that ableism and racism are linked. So racism is named in the definition of ableism by T.L. And so that's the definition that, I give to my students and I talk about, because for me, it really encapsulates that systemic issue, that it is not just interpersonal discrimination, but it's this larger system that depends on racism to function.
I'm not going to do the ableism one because that one's too difficult for me. And I'm too long-winded. I will share a little bit about what I've experienced in my short time in it. So I worked at CNN for 10 years. I've been in other newsrooms where there was a lot of like violence, like emotional violence around my disability and my blackness. I couldn't really parse out what was what. But when I got into disability spaces, it was assumed that I didn't have very much experience. They didn't really read my resume. They were talking to me like I had just like marched out of college and saying things to me like, you need to get a notebook and write this stuff down. When I was actually the only expert in the room in what we were talking about. And there was just this assumption that I didn't know that much. And yeah, that went on for a good year, I think. And it was a lot. But yeah, so it's not like when I say violence, I usually mean emotional violence. Like it's not physical, although I'm sure there probably is some. I haven't experienced it. Mine has been mostly emotional violence. You know, this is the one funny part is this one leader said to me, I'm going to put you up for the Young Leaders of Disability award. And I was like, I don't, what do you mean by young? And she was like, well, it ends at 30. And I'm like, I'll be 45 next birthday. What? And I was like, well, you did read my resume that I was at CNN for 10 years and then have been out of CNN for 5, so I don't know how I would be 29. That means I would have started at 14.
I think it's also interesting that even in my experience, the sort of violence that's pressed upon, especially people with disabilities of color, often falls in line with all of the sort of the old bag of tricks that we've seen, either at stealing of ideas. But I think the one that I used to see the most, even when I was in the feds, was the infantilization. Like I had a colleague who was man, I can't remember. She was her family heralded from the Middle East, wheelchair user, brilliant, several master's degrees. I knew that because I read her resume. Our colleagues would basically like mispronounce her name and basically steal her ideas every meeting we were in. And I remember she finally blew up and literally rolled out. And they were so shocked, and she came back and apologized and then left again. I remember catching her at her desk and I was like, you should not have apologized to those jerks. But like that's the sort of cultural space. And because she was a woman with a significant disability, she felt like she had to like take it and then like rise above it. And it's just that's a hard thing to do every day. And describing it as violence, I think we've all been at the business end of. That's a good way to think of it.
Yeah.
So we got the wrap. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Sammy.
Thank you all for being here. So nice to be in community conversation.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more hand for our panel. And thank you so much for joining us here at the Ford Foundation today. And we look forward to seeing you at future U.S. disability rights events. We have copies of Dr. Schalk's book just outside the room. And please enjoy some delightful snacks and beverages and have a chance to meet and talk to our speakers. Once again, thank you to our CART folks, our ASL interpreters, our events team, and all the folks that work so hard to pull these events together. And once again, thank you, Dr. Schalk, for giving us the pleasure of hosting this book launch. Next time we'll have a confetti cannon for you.